Thanks to Governor Scott Walker to talk about the fall legislative session and politics. Governor, welcome back to Wisconsin Eye.
Good to be with you.
I want to talk about some fall legislative issues and maybe talk a little politics.
Sure.
Let me ask you the first one. Last week, Wisconsin Eye did an interview with the Milwaukee Police Chief, Ed Flynn. He'd like to see tougher laws for criminals with guns. Representative Richards, Senator Darling working on a package. Have you had a chance to review the package? Something you could support, sir?
I haven't looked at the bill, but when the chief came out earlier in August and said that they'd like to have mandatory minimums or something like that for people illegally possessing a firearm, I said I have no problem cracking down on people who are illegally possessing firearms, and if law enforcement in Milwaukee and elsewhere around the state think that's an added tool for them in fighting criminals with firearms, I'm all for it.
But you don't think the state should help pay for the police overtime? Given
you know, it's one of those where I think there's some ways where we can help the city of Milwaukee deal with some of their foreclosure issues, particularly where there are drug houses and that related foreclosed properties, because we do that in other parts of the state, but putting a renewed focus in Milwaukee. But paying for overtime, to me, sets a dangerous precedent, because if I'm John Dickert, the mayor of Racine, if I'm the mayor of Kenosha, if I'm the mayor of Beloit, where do you draw the line there? And I think that's one of those where we've given tremendous savings to local governments, some of the biggest being the city of Milwaukee, and they can use that there. But we can help them on other ways, like I said, with foreclosures and other items.
Well, Chief Flynn did mention the item you vetoed. There was state money in the budget to tear down, well, he's got 8,000 vacant homes that he says are used by gangs, criminal activity, rapes. And he's sorry that you vetoed that provision that would have authorized money to tear a few of those down.
Well, we've sent a fair amount already, and we have a statewide program. We're going to target a fair amount of that. The reason we looked at in terms of the veto, though, is we didn't want to just earmark for one community. We wanted the flexibility because, again, even though the size is much smaller in the city of Racine, there's still a tremendous problem there. And so we wanted to address other communities that had similar concerns. Again, though, the major focus for us, just because of the size, both in population and the size of the problems in Milwaukee, and we're going to help just without a specific earmark in the legislature.
Second fall issue, Senator Darling and Representative Jim Ott have got 6 drunk driving bills. Do you see a need for any of them to pass? Are our drunk driving laws still too weak, sir?
Oh, I'd like to see, particularly when you see constant stories around the state about repeat offenders, folks who've had multiple offenses still being out on the road. I think that's a tremendous danger. And so any of the bills, and we'll look at the packages they've got out there, but any of the bills that help address that kind of repetition, it's bad enough, no one should ever drive intoxicated, no matter whether they've had an offense before or not. But when someone's been out multiple times, they're a true menace, and they have to crack down and keep them safe from the public.
You worried about the fiscal notes?
Oh, you look at any of those things, but I think there are ways you can measure that. I mean, to me, cracking down on someone and keeping them safe from the public doesn't necessarily mean besides behind a full maximum security prison. There are other ways, I think, creatively we can look at keeping people off the streets, keeping people in some degree of punishment away from their homes, but still not having to put them in a full-scale prison.
Third issue, Senator Olson and Representative Castell just announced their standards and accountability bill. Senator Olson told Wisconsin Eye this week it gives schools 6 years before his term, the death penalty. Do you like their bill, sir?
Well, I think that when we put together the report card, the panel of stakeholders for school and school district accountability, when Dr. Evers and I did that, we included both of those leaders in the legislature on education, as well as plenty of other folks in both parties and all different spectrums. And I've said all along, my belief is that the report card should be tightened up, and that any school that gets public dollars, be it a traditional public school, a charter school, or a voucher school, should be a part of the report card system, so that the public, the legislature, the education community, but most importantly the parents, can see what their sons or daughters are doing or could potentially do in terms of the quality of those schools. In terms of the details of how, we tried in this budget to initially apply some additional funding for high performers and high growth schools based on those report cards, and to put some money aside to help turn around failing schools. We'd still like to do that. I don't know if it's necessarily exactly the form that the two lawmakers have presented, but it's something we're willing to sit down and work with them on.
There's one provision in the Olson-Castell bill that deals with MPS, and it says, MPS, we're treating you as you're a failing district. Do you think MPS, do you see any signs that it's getting better?
Well, I think there are schools, unfortunately, they're failing, not just failing overall, but are failing students and failing parents in the city of Milwaukee, and that needs to be corrected. I also think there's great schools in the city of Milwaukee. I visited many of those as well, both traditional public schools as well as a number of charter schools, language immersion schools, Montessori schools. There's a full spectrum there, but what we should do, and part of the reason why I push so hard to have strong, aggressive report cards was so that we could replicate success, whether it's in Milwaukee or anywhere else across the state, replicate successful schools, and then by the same token, find out a way to identify those that are failing and figure out either how to get them to replicate that success, or in need be, the worst case, shut them down and reopen better schools in their place. And we'd like to do that. It's a little early for Milwaukee, just because we just finally, the tools that we gave every other school district in the state, just this year, this summer, as of June 30th, became effective for the Milwaukee public school system because their contract came up. And the real test is going to be coming into this school year, what the administration and what that school board is willing to do with those tools. If they set them aside, if they just keep the status quo, even though they don't have to per the law, well, then I think there's going to be parents in that community who are going to demand that we do something different. But I think they need at least a little time to show what they can do with those reforms.
Thank you. Two other issues. The Menominee Casino just landed right in your lap with the BIA. Is there a deadline for the 11 tribes to agree on a plan that would open Kenosha? I mean, do you want that done?
I give them a 60-day window.
60-day window.
Yeah, and I set this out not just recently. Remember, all these things that are now getting all this attention, nearly 2.5 years ago, I laid out my 3 criteria to all 11 tribal leaders. I meet every quarter with them, unlike previous governors who met once a year. I meet every quarter on site at a different site around the state of Wisconsin. I laid out at that time, back in 2011, like the phlegm of my 3 criteria. I laid out 2 meetings ago. My most recent meeting was just a few weeks ago, but at the one quarterly meeting before that in Menominee, actually with Chairman Korn and others, I laid out the fact that if the Bureau of Indian Affairs did announce what they recently announced, that I would give a 60-day window to them to work with the other 10 tribal governments to meet those 3 criteria.
Did your 60-day window start with the BIA?
Yes, we started it last week.
Started last week.
Yep.
One of your provisions is no net new gaming. So here's my question. If one casino with a handle of 100 million closed, and they open Kenosha with a potential handle of 400 million, does that break your no new?
That's one of those where I said, and I told that when I first brought up the criteria, and I've said it repeatedly since, that wasn't specified. What I tried to do was go back in the early 1990s. You remember there were multiple referendum questions that the public were asked about gaming. One of those was about expanded gaming, and the answer was overwhelmingly no. Now, that's 2 decades ago, so presumably things may or may not have changed, but that's the last public poll, if you will, that was actually taken by the voters. And so they didn't define that. I said there's some flexibility in terms of what that means, but there has to be some way to at least address the fact that nothing has changed, at least in terms of a new referendum vote since then. And I want to at least pay some credence to what the voters said, even though it was back in the early 1990s. So I don't have a hard and fast rule in that regard. That is one where they have to show me, make the case that they feel that they can at least argue that they're complying with what that vote was taken. The other item in terms of the consensus, that's pretty clear. People have asked, what does a consensus mean?
11
to me,
tribes, right?
Last time I checked, a consensus isn't a supermajority. It is a consensus, which means all 11. And that's one where, in this case, it applies not just in Kenosha. My criteria would apply to Beloit, Shullsburg, Sheboygan, anywhere else it was asked, and it would apply to everybody. So it's not just the Potawatomi who've raised some concerns. The Ho-Chunk in the last week have raised some concerns as well, and we're willing to bring people to the table, but the burden is largely on the 11 tribal governments, because remember, for all the talk about the free market, this isn't a free market situation. If it's a free market situation, Steve, you and I could decide we're going to start a gambling operation. We can't do that.
You're responding there to Senator Ellis's comments.
It's exclusivity. It's a ridiculous argument. Now, if he's got a bill that opens the door to anybody gaming in the state of Wisconsin, that's a whole other debate and a whole other discussion. But those 11 tribes and their compacts have an exclusive agreement with the state of Wisconsin to offer gaming operations here. And so it's only appropriate that we have those conditions that match those 11 tribes, because they made concessions based upon what they thought, for many of them, their own operations would be getting going forward.
Then the final state issue, the Affordable Care Act deadlines are approaching. What's your advice to the tens of thousands of residents that the budget would move from Badger Care to the health exchanges? What should they do?
They should aggressively work with the many different entities. I mean, for all the hype and discussion out there, I just met yesterday with members of the Hospital Association on a different issue, and was amazed at one of the attacks taken by me by someone who wrote a column in the Journal-Sentinel who just really, literally does not know what's going on. We've been meeting for months. Brett Davis, our Medicaid director, our Office of the Insurance Commissioner, has been meeting with hospitals, with clinics, with nonprofit healthcare entities to make sure that everybody's on board as to what the process is coming up October, the beginning of October, for the first wave going through January 1st of 2014. And so when all that information comes out in a very structured way so that the public will have full access to all that information, we anticipate that people living above poverty, who in the past may have been on Badger Care Plus, will have an opportunity to transition into the marketplace. If you're someone just above poverty, you're going to have the opportunity to get a premium plan that will be subsidized to the tune of $19 a month. And so there's going to be a real opportunity for people to find access to health care either in the traditional marketplace or in the federal exchanges. The bigger news, though, I think, is for people living in poverty who in the past, under my predecessor and prior to these changes, did not have access to health care through Badger Care Plus. Going forward, everyone living in poverty in the state is going to be covered under Medicaid.
Do you think the transition to the Affordable Care Act, what's your gut tell you? Is it going to go well? Is it going to be a train wreck?
Well, I think that the transition can work well because of the plan that Brett and the rest of our team have worked with the community of stakeholders around the state on. We've got navigators out there aggressively working with people. Anytime you make a transition to anything, I don't care what it is, there's always going to be some challenges. There were in the past when Governor Doyle expanded the opportunities for eligibility under Badger Care Plus. So we're trying to mitigate any of the challenges, but there's going to be some no matter what. It's not possible to make a change whether you're adding or changing or transitioning without some challenges out there. The train wreck that people talk about isn't the transition, it's national. It's the whole issue of whether or not the Affordable Care Act is going to work. Obviously have concerns about that. I've stated those repeatedly when I ran and ran again in the recall election. But despite my political beliefs about my frustrations about Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, it's the law. We're going to implement what we need to implement in the state of Wisconsin and make the case philosophically about why we think it should be altered nationally going forward.
Politics. This week, Democratic Party Chairman Tate called Mary Burke the front runner. Mm-hmm. Have you met her?
Oh, sure. In the past, when she was Secretary of Commerce under Jim Doyle.
Was she a good Secretary of Commerce?
I talked to her a couple times, handful of times. She implemented the policies of Jim Doyle. Those are the policies that in his last term saw the state lose more than 133,000 jobs. Said if people want to go back to the days of double-digit tax increases, billion-dollar budget deficits, and record job loss, then they should elect somebody who is lockstep with Jim Doyle. If in contrast people want to go forward and by any measure out there, we've gained tens of thousands of new jobs in this state. If they want to go forward and build off of that and put more people to work in this state with the policies we put in place that are moving Wisconsin forward, then I ask for their vote.
How are you going to explain it's pretty obvious we're not going to hit the 250,000 new jobs in the private sector. How are you going to explain that?
Well, we'll see. I mean, my pledge goes through 2015, and right now, we've had some challenges the first year and a half with all the protests, the recalls, the second wave of recalls, all the other factors involved with that. But having said that, just a week ago, the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia listed that from April to July of this year, we were ranked number 3 in terms of job growth and the projections for the next 6 months going forward. If we continue to have that kind of accelerated pace, whether we're at 251 or 249, whatever the magic number ends up being, I think what people want more than anything is the reason I had the aggressive goal in the first place, which is the makeup for the job loss we had under my predecessor, particularly the last 2 years when Governor Doyle was in place and his party controlled everything. And they've raised taxes. They made it harder for businesses to employ people. They made it tough to get the economy back on track. We made dramatic changes that have balanced our budget, did it without raising taxes, made it easier to create jobs in this state. I think going forward, people got to guess, do they want to go backwards to those failed policies, or do they want to move forward?
Presidential politics. Mm-hmm. Politico says you have a stealth campaign.
So stealth, I don't know about it.
University of Virginia, Larry Sabato rates you at the top. Have you seen the Washington Examiner? Traveling man, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker visits a dozen states to ignite his bid for the presidency. Do you deserve all this attention as a potential presidential candidate, sir?
I love being governor. As you know, I'm unique. I'm the only governor in American history ever elected twice in the same term, so I guess I get some attention. But in the end, I'm going to focus on being governor through the remainder of this term, and next year I'm going to announce my intentions in terms of going forward and having the opportunity to serve again for the next term as the governor of the state of Wisconsin and continue to put our policies in place. And I find it's flattering that people recognize the good work that we've done, how we dramatically have turned things around, what a contrast it is to what we saw in the past, to what we see in a real-time comparison in Illinois, where their economy still has a 9% plus unemployment rate, where their pension is the worst funded in the country, and where they won the burst bond ratings. Our bond rating is strong. Our pension's the only fully funded one in the country. Our unemployment rate's 6.8%, unlike their 9.1%. I think there's a dramatic contrast there, and I love telling that story.
Well, almost out of time. Just a couple questions. Are you qualified to be president?
I'd love to be the president of the Harley-Davidson Motor Company. I'd make a whole lot more money.
I was talking president of the United States, sir.
And I got a 2003 Road King. But that's one of those, the only qualifications I'm going to be talking about in the next few years is qualifications to be a great governor here in the state of Wisconsin.
Do you have to be reelected to run for president?
I have to be reelected to be able to fulfill the promises and the pledges and the goals and dreams I have for the state and moving forward. So that's the reason why I'm focused on that.
The national buzz, you as a presidential candidate, that's a pretty heady thing for a PK from Delaware, isn't it?
It is. It's a little surreal, actually. All the hype and the hysteria. Like I said, it's flattering. But the nice thing about that, though, I'll tell you, Steve, what's nice about it is it's not based on a lot of flash. It's not based on some great speech at a national convention. It's based on substance. It's based on results. And so for that, whether it ends up being anything or not, what I'm more proud of is the fact that people are paying attention to me, but more importantly to this state, because we've gotten things done. We turned the state around. We've proven real results. And I think that's why people are paying attention to us.
Governor Scott Walker, thanks for giving Wisconsin Eye the time.
Good to be you.
Thank you.